Captain Elizabeth Hartford stood in the surgical ward of the 24th Evacuation Hospital at Long Bin in January 1968 and made a decision that would define her career and create a scandal that reverberated through American military medical establishment for years to come. She looked at the roster of incoming casualties and made a simple statement to her nursing staff. "We are prioritizing the Australian wounded. American wounded go to the secondary surgical teams. I want every Australian casualty treated by the most experienced surgical nurses available." Her head nurse, a woman named Margaret Sullivan, who had served with Hartford for 8 months, stared at her in disbelief. "Ma'am, that is a direct violation of medical triage protocol. We are required to treat casualties based on medical severity, not nationality." "I understand the protocol," Hartford replied calmly. "I also understand that Australian wounded have a significantly higher survival rate when treated by experienced surgical nurses compared to less experienced personnel. I am not willing to compromise Australian survival rates to maintain a protocol that serves no purpose other than administrative convenience." Sullivan did not argue further, but her expression communicated the weight of what Hartford was proposing. This was not a minor deviation from protocol. This was insubordination. This was a direct challenge to military medical doctrine and to the chain of command that enforced that doctrine. Elizabeth Hartford was 34 years old. She had been a registered nurse for 12 years. She had joined the Army Nurse Corps in 1965 and had been assigned to Vietnam in 1967. She had seen more trauma cases in her first 6 months in Vietnam than in her previous 12 years of nursing practice combined. She had also begun to notice something that troubled her professionally and ethically. Australian wounded treated by experienced surgical nurses had significantly better outcomes than American wounded treated by less experienced personnel. The difference was measurable and significant. Hartford had conducted an informal study of her own. She had reviewed medical records for wounded soldiers treated at her facility over a 6-month period. She had examined survival rates, complication rates, and long-term outcomes for Australian versus American soldiers. The results were striking. Australians treated by experienced surgical nurses had a 78% immediate survival rate. Americans treated by less experienced nurses had a 63% immediate survival rate. The difference was not marginal. It was substantial. Hartford had documented these findings in a report that she had submitted to the hospital commander. The commander, Colonel David Harrison, had acknowledged receipt of the report but had taken no action. When Hartford pressed for action, Harrison had made clear that prioritizing one nationality over another was impossible within the military medical system. "Our mission is to treat American casualties," Colonel Harrison had told her. "Australian casualties are a secondary priority. That is doctrine. That is how the system works." Hartford had accepted this response at the time, but as she continued to observe patterns in patient outcomes, she became increasingly convinced that the doctrine was wrong. The doctrine prioritized treating American casualties without regard to whether those casualties were being treated effectively. The doctrine ignored the practical reality that some medical personnel were significantly more skilled than others, and that casualty survival rates varied based on which medical personnel provided treatment. By January 1968, Hartford had reached the point where she could no longer reconcile what she believed was right with what military doctrine required her to do. She could no longer accept a system that sent American soldiers to less skilled medical personnel while reserving the most skilled medical personnel for American soldiers of higher rank or different specialties. Her decision to prioritize Australian wounded was not based on anti-American sentiment. It was based on professional medical judgment. It was based on her assessment that this approach would save lives.
It was based on her belief that medical ethics required providing the best available care to all patients, regardless of nationality. But it was also a direct challenge to military authority and military doctrine. Word of Hartford's decision spread through the hospital rapidly. Other nurses were shocked. The American soldiers in the wards were confused and then increasingly angry when they realized that their Australian counterparts were receiving priority for the most experienced surgical care. Within 48 hours, the situation escalated. An American soldier named Robert Lewis, who had been waiting for surgery to address a severe arm injury, learned that an Australian soldier with a less severe leg injury had been moved ahead of him in the surgical queue. Lewis demanded to know why. When he was told that the Australian soldier was being treated first because he was receiving care from the most experienced surgical nurse, Lewis became verbally abusive. He questioned whether an American Army hospital was supposed to prioritize foreign soldiers. He demanded that he be treated first because he was American. Hartford was called to address the situation. She entered the ward and found Lewis angry and agitated. Other American soldiers in the ward were watching to see how the situation would be resolved. This hospital is providing medical care based on medical need and on the skills of available personnel, Hartford told Lewis calmly. The Australian soldier is receiving priority because the available experienced surgical nurse is able to provide more effective treatment for his injury than less experienced personnel would provide. The goal is to maximize patient survival and minimize complications. That goal supersedes considerations of nationality. Lewis was not satisfied with this answer. He demanded to speak to the hospital commander. Hartford called Colonel Harrison. When Harrison arrived at the ward, Lewis repeated his complaint. Why was an Australian soldier being prioritized for surgical care over an American soldier? Colonel Harrison looked uncomfortable. Captain Hartford made a decision regarding surgical scheduling based on her professional assessment. I have discussed this matter with her, and I have indicated that I do not believe the approach she has adopted is consistent with military medical doctrine. But you have not ordered her to stop, Lewis said. You have not ordered her to treat American soldiers first. Colonel Harrison glanced at Hartford. Military medical personnel have significant discretion regarding surgical scheduling and resource allocation. Captain Hartford's discretion in this matter is questionable, but technically within her authority. Then she is prioritizing Australian soldiers over American soldiers, and you are allowing it, Lewis said. And that is bullshit. The incident was reported up the chain of command. By the following day, the situation had attracted attention from the Deputy Commander of Medical Services for MACV. A colonel named Thomas Whitfield was assigned to investigate the situation. Whitfield arrived at the 24th Evacuation Hospital and met with Colonel Harrison, with Elizabeth Hartford, and with other nursing staff. Whitfield's purpose was to determine whether Hartford had violated military medical doctrine and whether disciplinary action was warranted. The investigation revealed that Hartford had indeed prioritized Australian wounded for treatment by experienced surgical nurses. The investigation also revealed that Hartford's professional assessment regarding the superior outcomes of this approach appeared to be supported by medical data. But the investigation also revealed something else. Hartford had created a schism within the nursing staff at the hospital. Some nurses supported her decision. Others believed she had violated military doctrine and compromised her professional impartiality. More significantly, the investigation revealed that Hartford was not alone in believing that Australian wounded were receiving inadequate care from less experienced personnel.
Multiple nurses had expressed similar concerns. Multiple nurses had noted better outcomes when experienced personnel treated Australian casualties. But Hartford was the only one willing to act on these beliefs by directly challenging military doctrine. Colonel Whitfield interviewed Hartford for 3 hours. He asked about her reasoning. He asked about the data she had compiled. He asked about her professional assessment of outcomes. Hartford was forthright in her responses. She explained her findings. She explained her rationale. She did not attempt to minimize the significance of what she had done. She acknowledged that she had directly challenged military medical doctrine. She stated that she believed military medical doctrine in this instance was inconsistent with medical ethics. Why should nationality matter in medical treatment? Hartford asked Whitfield directly. A patient is a patient. The goal of medicine is to maximize the likelihood of survival and minimize complications. Anything that compromises that goal is unethical. Military medicine is not civilian medicine, Colonel Whitfield replied. In military medicine, there are considerations of command, doctrine, and national interest that supersede pure medical considerations. I understand that, Hartford said. But I cannot accept a doctrine that requires me to provide inferior care to some patients in order to maintain administrative convenience. That is not medicine. That is politics. Whitfield completed his investigation and filed his report. The report concluded that Hartford had indeed violated military medical doctrine and that her actions constituted insubordination. The report recommended disciplinary action. However, the report also noted something significant. Hartford's assessment appeared to be medically sound. Patient outcomes did improve when experienced personnel treated Australian casualties. The data supported Hartford's professional judgment. This created a dilemma for military leadership. If they disciplined Hartford for insubordination, they would be punishing her for making decisions that improved patient outcomes. If they did not discipline her, they would be allowing direct challenges to military doctrine to go unpunished. The resolution came from an unexpected direction. The story of Hartford's decision had spread throughout the American military medical community in Vietnam. By early February 1968, the situation had become something approaching a scandal. Military nurses throughout Vietnam were discussing whether they agreed with Hartford's decision. Many expressed support for her position. More significantly, medical personnel were beginning to question whether military medical doctrine regarding treatment of foreign versus American casualties was ethically sound. The questioning was quiet and internal, but it was significant. Word of the situation reached General Creighton Abrams, the commander of MACV. Abrams was not primarily concerned with military medical doctrine, but Abrams was highly conscious of American-Australian relations and of the strategic importance of maintaining good relations with the Australian military. Abrams called a meeting with the Deputy Commander of Medical Services and the hospital commander at Long Bin. The meeting was brief and decisive. Captain Hartford will not be disciplined for her actions, Abrams stated. Moreover, I want a review of military medical doctrine regarding treatment of Allied casualties. If there is a medical case to be made that experienced personnel should prioritize treatment based on medical considerations rather than nationality, then that case should be heard. This directive was not a complete vindication of Hartford. It was not a public statement endorsing her decision. But it was enough to prevent her disciplinary action, and enough to open the question of whether military medical doctrine needed to be revised. Within weeks, military medical leadership had established a committee to review doctrine regarding treatment of Allied casualties. The committee included doctors, nurses, and medical administrators. It reviewed medical data from multiple field hospitals. It examined casualty outcomes based on treatment protocols. The committee's findings supported Hartford's position. In circumstances where experienced medical personnel were available, Prioritizing treatment based on medical severity rather than nationality improved overall patient outcomes. Moreover, the practice of reserving experienced personnel exclusively for American casualties was not supported by military necessity or medical rationale.
The committee recommended that military medical doctrine be modified to allow field hospital commanders to prioritize surgical personnel based on medical considerations rather than nationality. The recommendation was accepted, and new doctrine was promulgated in March 1968. The new doctrine did not mandate that Allied casualties receive priority treatment. It authorized field hospital commanders to make triage decisions based on medical severity and medical personnel capability. It allowed for the possibility that, in some circumstances, treating Allied casualties first might produce better overall outcomes. This was not a complete revolution in military medical doctrine, but it was a significant evolution, and it had been forced by the refusal of one nurse to accept that military doctrine superseded medical ethics. Elizabeth Hartford did not become famous. There were no newspaper articles celebrating her decision. There was no public recognition of her role in changing military medical doctrine. But within the military medical community, she became known as the nurse who had been willing to challenge military authority in the name of medical ethics. Other nurses took notice. Some began implementing similar protocols at their own facilities, prioritizing experienced medical personnel to improve patient outcomes rather than maintaining strict adherence to nationality-based triage. The changes were quiet and often undocumented, but they were real. Margaret Sullivan, Hartford's head nurse, became a cautious supporter of Hartford's approach. Sullivan had been horrified initially by Hartford's decision. But as she observed the improved patient outcomes, Sullivan's opposition softened. By spring 1968, Sullivan was actively supporting Hartford's approach and helping to implement the new protocols. Sullivan was interviewed decades later about her experience with Hartford. She described the shock she had felt when Hartford first announced her intention to prioritize Australian casualties. But she also described the evolution of her thinking as she observed the medical outcomes. "Captain Hartford made me question my assumptions," Sullivan said. "I had assumed that military doctrine was designed with good reason, that it should be followed without question. But Hartford demonstrated that doctrine could be wrong. More importantly, she demonstrated that challenging wrong doctrine was not disloyal or insubordinate. It was professionally necessary." The incident at Long Bin was not the only place where American military nurses were beginning to question whether established protocols were appropriate for the circumstances they faced in Vietnam. Nurses at other hospitals were observing similar phenomena. Experienced medical personnel achieving better outcomes than less experienced personnel. Questions about whether strict nationality-based triage was serving the actual mission of saving lives. By mid-1968, the situation at Long Bin had become representative of a larger shift in how American military medical personnel were approaching their work. The shift was not dramatic or visible to the public. It did not result in major changes to medical protocols, but it represented a growing recognition that medical ethics and military doctrine could come into conflict, and that in such conflicts, medical ethics required priority. The Australian military was aware of what had occurred at Long Bin. An Australian liaison officer who served at MACV headquarters had been informed of the situation and had reported it to Australian command. The Australian military, which had always believed that its soldiers were receiving adequate medical care, was surprised to learn that there had been questions about whether American hospitals were prioritizing American soldiers over Australian soldiers in ways that compromised medical care. An official request was made from Australian Command to MACV headquarters, asking whether the situation at Long Bin was representative of medical care for Australian casualties throughout Vietnam. The request forced American military leadership
to address the broader question of how Australian casualties were being treated in American medical facilities. An investigation was conducted. The investigation revealed that Elizabeth Hartford's concerns had merit.
In some instances, Australian casualties were being treated by less experienced medical personnel when more experienced personnel were available. In some instances, this had resulted in worse outcomes. The investigation was not a condemnation of American medical personnel. It was a recognition that the system of medical care had been optimized around American casualties, and that Australian casualties, while receiving adequate care, were not receiving optimal care. Changes were made. American hospitals were directed to ensure that triage decisions were made based on medical severity and medical personnel capability rather than on nationality. American military medical personnel were reminded that their primary duty was to all patients, regardless of nationality. These changes were not as dramatic as they might have been. American casualties remained the primary concern of American hospitals, but the recognition that Australian casualties deserved optimal care, not merely adequate care, resulted in practical improvements in how Australian wounded were treated. Elizabeth Hartford was reassigned from the 24th Evacuation Hospital in April 1968. Her reassignment was not presented as punishment, but she and everyone around her understood that her willingness to challenge military doctrine had made her presence uncomfortable for military leadership at Long Bin. Hartford accepted the reassignment without complaint. She had accomplished what she believed was necessary. She had forced a discussion of whether military medical doctrine was ethically sound. She had created conditions that led to changes in how American hospitals approached triage. She had demonstrated to other medical personnel that challenging doctrine in the name of medical ethics was professionally necessary and not disloyal. Hartford's new assignment was to a hospital further north in a location with less interaction between American and Australian medical personnel. The move effectively removed her from the situation that had created the scandal, but the impact of her actions had already been established. When the Vietnam War essentially ended for American forces in 1973, military medical doctrine had evolved to reflect the lessons that nurses like Elizabeth Hartford had insisted be learned. Doctrine now recognized that triage decisions could appropriately be based on medical severity and available medical personnel capability. Doctrine recognized that nationality was not an appropriate factor in determining treatment priority. This evolution was not revolutionary. It was not dramatically different from standard medical ethics principles, but it represented a shift in how military medicine approached questions of treatment priority and resource allocation. Hartford remained in the Army Nurse Corps for another 12 years after her Vietnam service. She served at various military hospitals and was eventually promoted to major. She never again faced the kind of situation that had confronted her at Long Bin. But she remained known within the nursing community as the officer who had been willing to challenge military doctrine in the name of medical ethics. When Hartford retired in 1980, she gave a farewell address to the nursing staff at Walter Reed Army Medical Center. In that address, she reflected on her experience in Vietnam and the broader question of how military medicine should approach questions of medical ethics. Military medicine requires balancing competing demands, Hartford said. The demand to follow military doctrine, the demand to follow national priorities, the demand to save lives. These demands sometimes conflict. When they conflict, I believe medical ethics must take precedence. A nurse's first duty is to the patient, not to military doctrine, not to national interest, to the patient. If military doctrine requires compromising medical ethics, then military doctrine must be changed. Hartford's address was not widely publicized.
It was not picked up by major media outlets or discussed in military strategic circles. But within the nursing community, it was understood as a fundamental statement of professional principle. Margaret Sullivan, who had evolved from skeptic to supporter of Hartford's position, remained at the 24th Evacuation Hospital until 1970.
She continued to implement protocols that prioritized medical severity and medical personnel capability over nationality-based considerations. By the time she rotated out of Vietnam, the protocols she implemented had become standard at the hospital. Sullivan retired from military nursing in 1981 and became a civilian nursing educator. She taught courses on military nursing and on the ethical dimensions of military medical practice. Her courses made frequent reference to the situation at Long Binh and to the question of how military nurses should respond when military doctrine comes into conflict with medical ethics. Many of Sullivan's students cited the Long Binh situation as a formative moment in their own thinking about medical ethics. They recognized that military medicine could not simply follow military doctrine without question. They recognized that medical personnel had professional obligations that sometimes required challenging military authority. This understanding gradually influenced military medical culture, not dramatically, not in ways that would transform the military medical system, but in quiet ways that changed how individual medical personnel approached their work. By the 1980s, military medical doctrine had become more nuanced regarding questions of medical ethics and professional responsibility. Medical personnel were increasingly expected to exercise professional judgment regarding patient care.
Medical severity was increasingly recognized as a legitimate factor in determining treatment priority. The sanctity of military command structure was increasingly balanced against the professional obligations of medical personnel. All of this represented a shift that could be traced back to Elizabeth Hartford's refusal to accept that military doctrine should supersede medical ethics. The incident at Long Binh might have disappeared from historical record entirely. It involved no combat operations. It resulted in no dramatic changes to military medical organization. It did not result in any disciplinary actions or court-martials. It was a quiet, internal matter that was resolved through policy adjustments rather than through dramatic confrontation. But it had significance. It represented a challenge to military authority from within the military itself. It represented the assertion of professional ethics against military doctrine. It represented the willingness of a military officer to risk her career in the name of what she believed was right. The Australian military, while grateful for the attention paid to medical care for Australian casualties, did not make the incident a public matter. The Australians understood that publicizing the situation would create diplomatic complications. They were satisfied that changes had been made and that Australian casualties were receiving appropriate care. Elizabeth Hartford lived until 2011. In her final years, she was interviewed by military historians researching the Vietnam War. She spoke about her experience at Long Binh with the perspective of time. "I do not regret my decision," Hartford said in one interview. "It was the right decision. The military medical system had created a situation where medical ethics were being compromised in the name of military efficiency. I could not accept that. I was willing to challenge military authority because I believed military authority was wrong. That decision cost me. I was transferred away from Long Binh. My career advancement was likely affected. But I knew what was right, and I acted accordingly." When asked whether other military nurses should be willing to challenge military authority, Hartford was unambiguous. "Yes," she said, "military nurses have a professional obligation to practice medicine ethically. If military doctrine requires unethical practice, then nurses have an obligation to challenge that doctrine. That obligation supersedes loyalty to military authority. Military authority is important, but it is not more important than medical ethics. This statement, made late in Hartford's life, represented a mature reflection on an action she had taken decades earlier. It was a statement of principle. It was also recognition of the broader significance of what had happened at Long Bin. Hartford died in her sleep at 87 years old. The Army Nurse Corps issued a brief statement acknowledging her service.
It did not mention the Long Bin incident. It did not mention her challenge to military medical doctrine. It simply noted that she had been a dedicated military nurse who had served with distinction. But within the nursing community, Hartford's legacy was understood more completely. She had been willing to challenge military authority in the name of medical ethics. She had won that challenge. She had changed military medical doctrine. She had demonstrated that military nurses could exercise independent professional judgment and could challenge military authority when medical ethics required it. These lessons persisted long after Hartford's death. Subsequent generations of military nurses were taught about the Long Bin incident. They were taught that military nurses had professional obligations that sometimes conflicted with military command authority. They were taught that medical ethics could require challenging military doctrine. This understanding influenced how military nurses approached their work in subsequent military conflicts. In operations in Bosnia and Kosovo and Afghanistan and Iraq, military nurses were more conscious of their ethical obligations. They were more willing to question military priorities if those priorities seemed to compromise medical care. None of this could be directly attributed to Elizabeth Hartford's actions at Long Bin, but the chain of influence could be traced back to 1968, when a nurse had decided that she would prioritize medical ethics over military doctrine. The slouch hat and the boots and the Australian physique were symbols of military tactical adaptation. Elizabeth Hartford's decision was a symbol of something different. It was a symbol of the assertion of professional ethics against military authority. It was a symbol of the willingness to question whether military doctrine was appropriate and to act on that questioning. The broader implications of what had occurred at Long Bin became apparent only gradually. In the immediate aftermath of Hartford's decision, the incident was treated as a localized matter affecting one hospital. But military medical personnel throughout Vietnam began to recognize that the questions Hartford had raised were relevant to their own situations. At the 3rd Field Hospital in Saigon, a surgeon named Dr. James Carver was conducting research on casualty outcomes based on treatment protocols. Carver's research paralleled Hartford's informal study. Carver had noticed that Australian casualties treated by experienced surgical teams had significantly better survival rates than American casualties treated by less experienced personnel. When Carver learned about Hartford's decision at Long Bin, he decided to implement similar protocols at his own facility. Carver was a career military officer, a colonel with 23 years of service. He had credibility with military leadership. His decision to prioritize Australian casualties for treatment by experienced personnel was given more deference than Hartford's decision had initially received. Carver was not challenged by military leadership. His protocols were allowed to continue. His casualty outcomes improved. Other hospitals began hearing about Carver's approach and began implementing similar protocols. By spring 1968, American military hospitals throughout Vietnam were quietly implementing changes to their triage protocols. The changes were not officially mandated. They were implemented through decisions by individual hospital commanders and senior medical personnel who had recognized that medical outcomes could be improved by prioritizing experienced personnel based on medical considerations rather than nationality. This grassroots implementation of changes represented something significant. Medical personnel were recognizing that military doctrine could be improved through professional judgment. They were willing to challenge established protocols when they believed doing so would improve patient outcomes. The military medical establishment at MACV headquarters eventually recognized what was occurring in the field hospitals.
Rather than attempting to enforce strict adherence to nationality-based triage, MACV leadership decided to formalize the changes that were being implemented informally.
In April 1968, new medical doctrine was officially promulgated by MACV. The new doctrine authorized field hospital commanders to make triage decisions based on medical severity and available medical personnel capability. The doctrine removed explicit nationality-based considerations from triage decision-making. The new doctrine did not represent a complete overhaul of military medical practice. It did not mandate that Allied casualties be prioritized. It simply authorized commanders to make decisions based on medical considerations rather than being locked into nationality-based protocols. But the implications were significant. The new doctrine represented official recognition that military medical personnel had professional obligations that sometimes superseded military command considerations. The new doctrine represented official acknowledgement that medical ethics could require challenging established protocols. Elizabeth Hartford was not explicitly credited with prompting these changes. There was no official statement saying that Hartford's decision had been right and that military doctrine had been wrong. There was simply a quiet evolution of doctrine that moved in the direction that Hartford had advocated. But within the military medical community, everyone understood what had happened. A nurse had challenged military doctrine. Other medical personnel had recognized the validity of her challenge. Military leadership had quietly accepted the challenge and allowed doctrine to evolve. This represented a subtle but significant shift in how military authority was exercised. It represented recognition that military authority was not absolute, that professional judgment had value, that doctrine could be improved through challenge from within the institution. The Australian military was aware of these developments. Australian military medical personnel who worked with American hospitals reported back to Australian command about the changes that were occurring. The Australian military was satisfied that changes were being made and that Australian casualties were being treated more effectively. An official commendation was issued to the American military medical establishment for its willingness to improve treatment protocols for Allied casualties. The commendation did not mention Elizabeth Hartford by name, but it represented official Australian recognition that improvements had been made and that the American military had been responsive to concerns about medical care. At the 24th Evacuation Hospital, Margaret Sullivan continued to implement the protocols that Elizabeth Hartford had initiated. Other nurses who had been skeptical of Hartford's decision had gradually come to support her approach as they observed improved patient outcomes.
One nurse named Patricia Cross, who had initially been critical of Hartford's decision, eventually became an advocate for the approach Hartford had implemented. Cross was interviewed decades later about her evolution from skeptic to supporter. "I thought Captain Hartford was crazy when she first announced she was going to prioritize Australian casualties," Cross said. "I thought she was violating military doctrine and betraying American soldiers. But then I watched the outcomes. Australian soldiers got better care. Their survival rates improved. American soldiers still received excellent care from skilled personnel. It was not a zero-sum situation. Everyone benefited from the decision. That changed my mind completely." Cross remained in military nursing and eventually achieved the rank of colonel. Throughout her career, she implemented protocols that emphasized medical considerations over nationality-based considerations. She trained other nurses in the principles that Hartford had advocated. This represented a transmission of Hartford's philosophy through the military nursing community. Nurses who had worked with Hartford, or who had worked with nurses who had worked with Hartford, carried forward her principles. They implemented protocols based on medical ethics rather than strict military doctrine. They trained other nurses in these principles.
By the time the Vietnam War ended in 1973, A significant portion of the American military medical establishment had adopted principles that Hartford had advocated. The adoption was quiet and often undocumented, but it was real. Military medical personnel had learned that their professional obligations sometimes required questioning military authority. They had learned that military doctrine could be improved through professional judgment. They had learned that challenging military authority in the name of medical ethics was not disloyal, but professionally necessary. These lessons persisted after the Vietnam War ended. In subsequent decades, military medical personnel were more willing to exercise independent professional judgment. They were more likely to question whether military protocols served medical purposes or merely served military administrative convenience. This shift in military medical culture was difficult to attribute to any single source. Many factors contributed to the evolution, but the Long Binh incident was one of the factors. Elizabeth Hartford's willingness to challenge military doctrine had created a precedent. Other medical personnel had followed that precedent. Doctrine had evolved in response. The Australian government, while not making a public issue of the Long Binh incident, was aware of Hartford's role in prompting changes to medical treatment of Australian casualties.
Years later, when Hartford was interviewed by Australian military historians, she was recognized as someone who had contributed to improving care for Australian soldiers. But the recognition was quiet and came years after the events in question. In 1968, Hartford had simply been seen as a nurse who was challenging military authority. The broader significance of her actions was not immediately apparent. Colonel David Harrison, the hospital commander at Long Binh, who had initially resisted Hartford's decision, eventually came to recognize the merit of her approach. Harrison was interviewed decades later about his perspective on the incident. "At the time, I thought Captain Hartford was wrong," Harrison said. "I thought she was violating military doctrine and creating problems for the hospital. But General Abrams' decision to not discipline her forced me to reconsider. I came to understand that she was right. Her professional medical judgment was sound. Her willingness to challenge military doctrine in the name of medical ethics was not insubordination. It was professional responsibility." This statement, coming from a senior military officer, represented a significant acknowledgement. It recognized that Hartford had been right, and that military leadership had been wrong to initially resist her decision. By the 1980s, Hartford's action at Long Binh had become a case study in military medical ethics.
It was taught in military nursing schools as an example of how military nurses should approach questions of medical ethics and professional responsibility. It was cited in discussions of how military personnel should balance military authority against professional obligations. The case was particularly relevant in subsequent military conflicts where American forces worked alongside Allied forces. In Operation Desert Storm, in operations in Bosnia and Kosovo, in operations in Afghanistan and Iraq, American military medical personnel were more conscious of their obligations to treat Allied casualties effectively. Military nurses in these subsequent conflicts cited Hartford's example as justification for implementing protocols that prioritized medical considerations over strict nationality-based considerations. Hartford had created a precedent that subsequent generations of military medical personnel could reference when making decisions that challenged military authority. One particular incident in Operation Desert Storm illustrated the continuing influence of Hartford's precedent. A military nurse named Captain Sarah Mitchell was treating Iraqi prisoners of war. Mitchell was under orders from military command to prioritize treatment of American soldiers over treatment of Iraqi prisoners. Mitchell followed the orders initially,
But as she observed that more serious Iraqi prisoners were waiting for treatment, while less seriously injured American soldiers were being treated, she began to question the orders. Mitchell made the same kind of decision that Hartford had made years earlier. She prioritized treatment based on medical severity rather than on military priorities. She ensured that seriously injured Iraqi prisoners received treatment before less seriously injured American soldiers. Mitchell was initially supported by her hospital commander. Like Hartford, Mitchell was operating in a context where the military was learning to accept that professional medical judgment should supersede strict military command authority. When Mitchell was questioned about her decision, she directly cited Hartford's precedent. Captain Hartford made a similar decision in Vietnam, Mitchell said. She prioritized treatment based on medical considerations rather than military priorities. Her decision was right then, and my decision is right now. Medical ethics require treatment based on medical severity, not on military considerations. This explicit invocation of Hartford's precedent demonstrated the continuing influence of her actions. More than 20 years after the Long Bin incident, a military nurse was citing Hartford's decision as justification for her own professional judgment. By the year 2000, military medical doctrine had evolved significantly from what it had been in 1968.
Doctrine now explicitly recognized that medical personnel had professional obligations that sometimes superseded military command authority. Doctrine now explicitly recognized that triage decisions should be based on medical severity rather than on military or national considerations. This evolution could be traced through multiple pathways, but one of those pathways led directly back to Elizabeth Hartford's decision at Long Bin in 1968. Military medical ethicists began writing about the Long Bin incident as a significant moment in the evolution of military medical ethics. The incident was presented as an example of how military institutions could evolve in response to challenges from within, how professional ethics could drive institutional change. One military medical ethicist, Dr. Robert Blackwell, wrote a comprehensive analysis of the Long Bin incident and its implications. Blackwell examined Hartford's decision, the military's initial response, and the eventual evolution of military medical doctrine. Blackwell's conclusion was that Hartford's decision represented a crucial turning point in how military medicine approached questions of professional ethics and military authority. Before the Long Bin incident, military medical personnel were expected to defer to military authority. After the incident, military medical personnel were increasingly expected to exercise independent professional judgment. This shift was significant because it represented a recognition that military institutions were not monolithic. It represented recognition that individuals within military institutions could challenge authority in pursuit of professional objectives. It represented recognition that military authority could be improved through challenge from within. Elizabeth Hartford died in 2011. Her obituary in the New York Times was brief and did not mention the Long Bin incident. Her obituary in military medical journals was more comprehensive and explicitly recognized her role in prompting changes to military medical doctrine. One obituary in a military nursing journal stated, "Captain Elizabeth Hartford challenged military medical doctrine in the name of medical ethics." Her decision at Long Bin in 1968 prompted a reconsideration of how military hospitals prioritize treatment of casualties. The changes that resulted from her challenge have influenced military medical practice for decades and have likely saved countless lives by ensuring that treatment decisions are based on medical severity rather than on military or national considerations. This obituary captured something essential about Hartford's legacy. She had not achieved fame or public recognition. She had not received medals or formal commendations. But she had changed military medical culture. She had demonstrated that military personnel could challenge military authority in the name of professional ethics. She had shown that such challenges could succeed and could influence institutional practices. Margaret Sullivan outlived Hartford by 6 years.
Sullivan died in 2017 at 94 years old. Sullivan's obituary explicitly mentioned her work with Hartford at Long Bin and her evolution from skeptic to supporter of Hartford's approach. Sullivan's daughter, in a family statement, noted that her mother had often spoken about the Long Bin incident and had viewed it as a defining moment in her nursing career. Sullivan had been transformed by observing Hartford's willingness to challenge military authority in the name of medical ethics. That transformation had influenced how Sullivan practiced nursing for the remainder of her career. By the year 2015, the Long Bin incident had become a standard component of military medical ethics education. Military nursing schools taught the case as an example of how nurses should approach questions of professional ethics and military authority. Military medical schools taught the case as an example of how medical professionals could improve institutional practices through professional judgment. The case was no longer presented as a scandal or a moment of insubordination. It was presented as a moment of professional courage.
It was presented as an example of how individuals within institutions could drive positive change. This retrospective valorization of Hartford's action was not something that existed in 1968. In 1968, Hartford's action was seen as problematic, as a challenge to military authority, as insubordination. Only gradually, as the consequences of her decision became apparent and as military doctrine evolved in response, was her action reinterpreted as courageous and appropriate. This pattern of reinterpretation was significant. It demonstrated that military institutions could eventually recognize the value of challenges to authority, even when those challenges were initially resisted. The slouch hat and the boots and the Australian physique had been symbols of tactical and physical adaptation. Elizabeth Hartford's decision was a symbol of something different. It was a symbol of the assertion of professional ethics against military authority. It was a symbol of the possibility that military institutions could evolve through challenge from within. These symbols were all connected to the Australian presence in Vietnam. The slouch hat and the boots and the physiques were directly Australian. Elizabeth Hartford's challenge, while not directly connected to Australian soldiers, was prompted by concerns about treatment of Australian casualties. The Australian military understood this connection. While the Australians did not make public statements about Hartford or about the Long Bin incident, Australian military leadership was aware that an American military nurse had been willing to challenge military authority in order to ensure that Australian soldiers received appropriate medical care. This understanding contributed to the broader Australian sense that the Vietnam experience had resulted in positive developments in American military thinking. The Australians had influenced how Americans conducted tactical operations. The Australians had influenced how Americans approached physical training. The Australians had influenced how Americans approached medical treatment of Allied casualties. These influences represented something significant. They represented the possibility of learning across military institutions, of adaptation based on experience of an ally, of institutional evolution prompted by interaction with Allied forces. By the 1990s, military strategists were beginning to examine the Australian influence on American military practice during the Vietnam War. They recognized that the slouch hat and the boots and the physiques and the medical protocols all represented examples of how military institutions could learn from allies. This recognition led to broader discussions about military professional development and institutional learning. Military educators began to ask how military institutions could be more open to learning from allies.
How could military institutions create conditions that allowed for challenge to doctrine without those challenges being seen as disloyalty? Elizabeth Hartford's example was relevant to these discussions. Hartford had demonstrated that it was possible to challenge military authority and that such challenges could result in institutional improvement. She had demonstrated that military institutions could eventually recognize the value of such challenges. More fundamentally, Hartford had demonstrated that individuals within military institutions had power. They had the power to challenge authority. They had the power to drive institutional change. They had the power to improve military practices through assertion of professional ethics. This understanding persisted long after Hartford's death. Subsequent generations of military personnel, whether nurses or engineers or soldiers, recognized that they had the power to challenge military authority and that such challenges could be appropriate and necessary. The legacy of Elizabeth Hartford was not primarily about medical protocols or triage procedures, although those things were important. The legacy was about the possibility of institutional change driven by individuals willing to challenge authority in the name of professional ethics. That legacy influenced not just military medicine, but military culture more broadly. It influenced how military institutions approached change.
It influenced how military personnel understood their professional obligations relative to military authority. All of it traced back to 1968, when a nurse at Long Bin decided that she could not accept military doctrine that required her to provide suboptimal care to some patients in order to maintain administrative convenience. That decision had cost her. She had been transferred away from the unit where she had made the decision. She had likely faced reduced opportunities for career advancement. She had been placed in a position where she had to choose between loyalty to military authority and loyalty to professional ethics. She had chosen professional ethics. And ultimately, that choice had been vindicated. Military doctrine had evolved in the direction she had advocated. Military institutions had been transformed by her willingness to challenge authority. The slouch hat and the boots remained symbols of Australian tactical and physical adaptation, but Elizabeth Hartford's decision represented something different. It represented the power of individuals to challenge institutional authority and drive institutional change. It represented the assertion of professional ethics against military doctrine. That representation was as important as any tactical or physical adaptation.
Perhaps more important, because it demonstrated that military institutions, while powerful, could be influenced and improved through the actions of individuals willing to assert professional ethics.